Welcome back from the ad break. Let's get on with our lesson. Okay, so let's have a look. Now we're going to have a look at Lamarckism. So we're going to have a look at this aspect. It's a theory that was proposed by a man called Lamarck, and he put forward two laws. The one is called the law of use and disuse, and the other one is called the law of inheritance of acquired characteristics. So now we're going to have a look at specifically at that segment. Oops. All right, so let's have a look here. This is what we call a mind map. It's a very nice study tool that you can use when you are studying to set out information. And if we have a look here, here we have our main concept is the theories of evolution. And here we have the two main theorists that we are going to look at is Darwin and Lamarck. And for now, we're going to look specifically at the two aspects, Lamarck's two laws, the law of use and disuse and inheritance of acquired characteristics. We'll look at later, we'll have a look at Darwin and his natural selection, as we've already said, and then we'll have a look at punctuated equilibrium. So we'll have a look at these two later. Okay. All right, so let's have a look at Lamarck's theory. So basically, Lamarck worked in the 18th century, and what he believed is that organisms so for example, the giraffe here, all organisms were born exactly the same. They all looked exactly the same. They had the same characteristics. And what happened is, during their lifetime, for example, the giraffes, if we have a look here, here you can see a giraffe, not like we know it today, but one that is eating with a short neck and is eating off the ground. So he believed that all giraffes were born with short necks, and what happened is once the food on the ground ran out and there was competition from other organisms, they started to feed out of the trees. And by stretching up to the tree to reach the food there, the neck started to elongate. And the more they stretched, the longer the neck became. And when the neck became longer, they were able to reach higher up in the tree. And so the neck became even longer, and they were able to reach even taller trees and even longer. And now they were able to reach very tall trees and basically eliminate any competition from other animals. Okay, so and then this would happen in an organism's lifetime. So during its lifetime, the organism would actually, its neck would grow. And then once it had grown, then it would select or decide to choose that characteristic, and it would then pass that on to its offspring. So that the next generation of giraffes were born with long necks. Okay, and this was Lamarck's theory. Okay, so his two laws that he set forward or put forward was the law of use and disuse. So let's have a look at this one. So what he believed here is that if organs or structures were used, they would grow, develop. Then they would develop and become whatever, stronger, longer, bigger, whatever. And that then, they would then pass that on to their offspring. The part of the disuse, there he believed that when organs were not used, so in other words, an organism didn't use those organs. So when organs or structures were not used, they disappeared. Okay, so this was Lamarck's theory. Okay, Lamarck's second law was known as the law of inheritance of acquired characteristics. So let's break that down. So basically what he's saying is that organisms inherit an acquired characteristic. And what does the word acquired mean? Acquired means that we get this or develop this characteristic during our lifetime, develop this in our lifetime. Okay, so his law then said that it's a characteristic that is developed in the lifetime that is inherited by the offspring of that organism that has developed or acquired that characteristic. Okay, let's look at Lamarck's laws in more detail. All right, so the first law, the law of use and disuse, what Lamarck suggested is that animals changed over time so that they could survive in a new environment. He also said that, that if a structure was used more often, that structure then became bigger in the following generations. Okay, so for example, the long neck of the giraffe. So as the giraffe stretched to get to the leaves and they wanted to get to the nice brand new or young leaves at the top of the tree, they then stretched their necks and those then developed more and more, and each generation the neck got longer, and that was passed on to the offspring. Okay, similarly, he said that if a structure was not being used, then this structure, say if it was not used, then this structure would become smaller and might even disappear. And that's, we can have a look and see here in this diagram again. So what he believed is that snakes were lizard-like, so they looked a lot like a lizard with 4 limbs, 2 forelimbs and 2 hind limbs. And as they went and burrowed in the soil or lived under rocks or whatever, the space was very narrow, which then didn't allow them really to use those limbs. So those limbs were there, but they didn't use them. So the less they used the limbs, the smaller they became, until eventually the limbs completely disappeared. And this is how we know snakes today without any limbs. Okay. All right, now Lamarck's second law, the law of inheritance of acquired characteristic. So he also explained that organisms then, as I said earlier, once they had acquired or developed these characteristics, they then would pass these on to their offspring. So organisms in the next generation would inherit these changed structures from their parents. And that's he called the law of acquired characteristics, inheritance of acquired characteristics. Okay, so basically, and if you think of anything today, so in other words, when you know these young people that go to the gym and they develop all these big muscles. So according to Lamarck, what would happen then is when those people then have children or have offspring, they would also be born very buff and very muscly. And that, you know, that was according to Lamarck's theory. All right, so if you have a look here, he says that the characteristics developed during the life of an individual. Okay, so one individual would change the structure, or would change their structure, or their body structure would change because they used or they didn't use an organ or a part of their body frequently, and then that would be passed on to its offspring. So over a lifetime, the giraffe could develop an elongated neck, allowing it to get much more food. There weren't any other organisms that were as tall as the giraffe, and they would not be able to reach the leaves. And you know, when a tree grows, the lovely, crisp, fresh, delicious, juicy leaves are right at the top of the tree. So this allowed the giraffe then to get to those leaves, and there weren't any other animals that were able to feed off that. And that characteristic, so that long neck that was developed during the giraffe's lifetime, the parents could then pass this elongated neck to the offspring. All right, so there we can see. Okay, so initially he believed that all the giraffe were born with short necks, But as they used them over time in that lifetime, so the necks became much longer, and they were then able to feed off much taller trees. And then there was no competition, so they were then able to survive. Okay, so why was Lamarck wrong? Why do we not accept his theory? Okay, so we know today we have the benefit of knowledge that has been developed after Lamarck developed his theory about genetics. So Mendel worked long after Lamarck, and so we know that genetics is, it involves genes which actually affect the phenotype. So it's not the phenotype, so the physical appearance cannot affect the genes. It was the other way around. So if we have a look here, we know that organisms don't evolve because they are determined to change. That change happens randomly. So that those changes take place randomly, and they take place through mutations. So it's when the DNA replicates or when protein synthesis is taking place that these mutations occur, because it's mutations that would affect a characteristic. Those mutations, and to be passed on to a next generation, must be when gametogenesis is taking place, and not simply happening through a lifetime of an individual. And they are then, it doesn't change the genetics. Okay. And if we have a look here, the acquired characteristics cannot be inherited. So if I develop strong muscles, or I grow my hair, or I chop off a finger, or I lose a leg in an accident, that is not going to change my genotype. It has absolutely no effect on my genotype. And it's my genotype that is already established when the sperm cell and egg cell fused to form a zygote. That is where the genetics is, or the genotype of an organism is established. And it's that genotype that remains the same. There's no ways of changing your genotype. So even if I do acquire certain phenotypic changes or characteristics in my lifetime, I'm not going to be able to pass those on to my offspring. They would then have to, a change in the phenotype would have to take place through mutation. Okay, so, and scientists have tested this theory of Lamarck, where they conducted investigations where they actually chopped off the tails of mice. And when they chopped off those tails, they allowed those mice then to breed. And when the offspring were born, they were all born with tails. So this is why we know that Lamarck's theory is not a plausible explanation of evolution. But we study Lamarck's theory so that we can understand how scientific knowledge has developed. So this is why we say there's a hypothesis that can be tested or rejected, or we test it and it can either be accepted or rejected, and then that then builds onto a theory. And so as new knowledge is developed, so we might change our ideas and our theories that we might have developed early on. And this is definitely what has taken place with Lamarck's theory. Okay, so let's have a look at what we've covered so far. So if we have a look at our theories of evolution, we've had a look at one of the theories, and that is Lamarckism. And we call it Lamarckism because it was put forward by a theorist or a scientist called Jean Lamarck. And his theory, basically, he had two laws. Okay, so remember that there were two laws for his theory, and the first one is the law of use and disuse, and that's where we learned that if an organ is used, it develops, and if it's not used, then it can disappear. It gets smaller, it becomes smaller, or it can even disappear. Okay, so that then is his law of use and disuse. All right, and then if we have a look at his second law, he said that the second law was that organisms would inherit an acquired characteristic. So in other words, parents would develop a characteristic, or an individual so they developed a characteristic during their lifetime. And this characteristic that was inherited during their lifetime would then be passed on to their offspring. Okay, and we know that, characteristics can't be passed, or phenotype cannot change genotype. So that is why we say that although his laws, he did put forward these laws, that with more knowledge that we have acquired, or we have learned, or we have developed, that we now realize that his theory is not accepted. So we actually reject his theory.